Hello and welcome to another story of hope. My guests today are Steve and Sheila Meharry. Steve and Sheila, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
So I know that you love your grandkids and you have a couple of boys, but some years back there was a special little girl that entered the picture. So let's go back to that year. What year was that? And tell us the story surrounding that.
That was April of 2013. And we'd made plans to go and visit her. I'd been having some foot problems, so I was seeing a doctor twice a week. And before we left, I went in and saw him, and I said, you know, my foot's really been hurting me the last couple of weeks. And he checked it out, and he said, everything seems to be fine, and it's healing. So when Sheila came home from work that night, I wasn't feeling that good. And she said, are you sure we should go to Missoula to see the kids? And I said, oh, we got to go see our new granddaughter. We haven't got to see her yet, and this might be the last chance for a while with our busy schedules. So the next morning, we got up, and she said, how you feel? I said, I'm packed. So we headed off to Missoula. And that
you live in Walla Walla, and Missoula is how many hours away?
It's a good 6-hour drive.
So it's not in your backyard. This is something you have to make some plans for.
Right.
Okay, so you're off to Missoula on this 6-hour trip, 6 hours away from home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When we arrived, about 1 o'clock, 1:30, my son said, Dad, I got to run into town and get some parts and some groceries. You want to come with me? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. Well, once we got into town, I started feeling really lousy. I was sweaty and I was getting the chills. I was going from hot to cold. And finally I said, I'm just going to stay in the van at the last stop and leave the heater on because I was really cold. He comes out and he goes, Dad, he said, Dad, it's hot in here. And I said, oh, I'm just right. Then we got back to the house and...
now this was the kind of so hot that when you open the door, it just kind of blows you away,
yeah.
right?
Oven.
Yeah.
He couldn't figure out what I was doing. Got back to the house, we went upstairs and into the house, and I just couldn't get warm, and so they started covering me up with blankets, and I wanted badly to hold that new granddaughter, but being as I wasn't feeling the best, I kind of looked at her from a distance and got to at least pay attention while they opened up some of the gifts we brought for her.
Now, Sheila, were you concerned at all at that point?
Yeah, I was, and I thought possibly he is diabetic, so I thought maybe his blood sugar was high or low, and so we wanted to, I asked him if he had taken his insulin lately, and he said yes, and so I believed him, but we also thought that he might just be coming down with a cold too, so, but that was my concern. So we went to bed that night, and the next morning was Sabbath, and we got up, and
so you weren't too worried at this point?
not horribly bad, but I did ask him, I go, are you sure we should just stay home and not go to church? Oh no, he said, I promised Joshua that I would go to Sabbath school with him.
Now, Joshua's your grandson?
He's the oldest grandson at 4, yeah, and then Josiah is 2, and JCL was just newborn. So we get to church, and Steve does go to Sabbath school with Joshua, and it happened to be Communion Sabbath that day. So we were sitting in church, and we were just breaking for foot washing when I looked over at Steve, and he was awfully sweaty. And he had a leather jacket on, and I said, Steve, let's take your jacket off. You're sweating. So he was kind of acting like this, very lethargic, and we finally got the coat off of him. And I said, well, you stay there. He wasn't going anywhere. And I went down to find Jared, our son, and I said, Jared, I think we need to get Daddy to the hospital. And so he said, well, I've got a friend here who is a nurse, and she threw a blood pressure cuff on Steve. And she said, well, either my blood pressure cuff is broken or he's in bad shape. And I go, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with your blood pressure cuff. We probably need to get him to the hospital right now. So they did. They found a wheelchair, and it took about 3 men to get him up out of the pew. And earlier that day, the song service, special music, there was a beautiful song being sung by a lady, and the song entitled was One Day at a Time. And I carried that song with me throughout this whole ordeal, because when we got to the hospital, they removed his shoe, and the smell just threw the EMT guy right out of his chair because of the stench. And what is happening is he had necrotizing fasciitis, which is a flesh-eating disorder, and they were going to need to remove his foot. And so they took a CT scan of Steve, and do you want to fill in anything right now on this?
You weren't necessarily going to lose your foot, right? I mean,
No, they did a bunch of tests first, and then they called in some specialists, and after the CT scan, they did the lab work. They decided it was that flesh-eating disease, and so the doctor, he said to me, he said, well, there's probably no sure way to get rid of this disease. We can put you on antibiotics, which they started me with antibiotics, but he said that's no guarantee. And so then he went out, and by this time Sheila and Jared had come back. They'd taken the family home to get some lunch, and he talked with them out of the room, and that's when he told them that probably the fastest way that I may be able to survive would be to amputate my leg to get rid of that infection. And Sheila
was that hard to tell Steve? The options that he had?
The option, yes, and I didn't want to be a part of it.
So what did you do?
So I called Jared and I said, Jared, get over to the hospital right now, because you need to see the CT scan and help me make a decision, because the doctor was asking me for a decision to either remove his foot or to just hope that the antibiotics would work.
What were you seeing on the scan?
We had seen, so Jared had come, and we were both looking at the scan, and a picture of his foot, and there were these black marks that were going up towards his ankle, up onto his ankle already. And we asked the doctor what that meant, and he said that's the gas that is it's slowly moving through and going towards his heart, and we need to stop that right now, to stop that flesh-eating disease. And we need to cut it off. That was his recommendation. And so I turned to Jared and I said, Jared, you need to be the one to tell your father that he's going to lose his foot. I don't want to be the one to tell him, because I know he's going to have a fight. We're going to have a fight on our hands when we tell Steve that that's the only option.
Because Steve's always been active.
Right.
So losing a foot was a really big deal. I mean, you're not the kind of person that sits around and plays on a computer all day long.
No.
I know that. So how were you feeling at this time? And tell me how you felt or what you said when they told you these are your options.
Well, since my body was shutting down, I didn't have a real clear mind, but when Jared came in and explained the options, I just said, no way. They're not taking my leg. I'd seen other people lose their legs, and I wasn't about to do that. And Jared just says, Dad, your ankle is bad. It's been bad for a long time with the arthritis, and according to the CT scan, your ankle's in really poor shape, and I think you could get along better without it. Plus, we want you to live, Dad. You've got 3 grandchildren here, and them and your Pathfinders need you. So I said, okay, let's go for it. And the orthopedic surgeon came in and explained everything, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in recovery room.
Now, for our audience's sake, you mentioned Pathfinders, which is a co-educational scouting type program that's run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and you've been a leader in Pathfinders for the last 90 years, right?
44 years.
We're getting close.
Yeah.
And I know that means a lot to you. So Jared said, your grandkids, the kids in Pathfinders that you minister to, we need you. And he was right. We do. So what happened next?
Well, I woke up in the recovery room, and it wasn't long thereafter that Jared and the grandkids and Sheila and my aunt came in to visit. And my youngest grandson at the time was 2-year-old, had been in the hospital 2 weeks earlier to see his mom and his new baby sister. Mm-hmm. And so he came up to the bed and said, "Grandpa, where's your baby?" And I said, "What?" And then Janetta explained that to me. And so then we, in the meantime, Jared said, "You know, Dad, as you left the church, the whole church started praying for you."
And you're talking about his church in Missoula.
His church in Missoula, yes. And on Monday, they took me back into surgery to make sure there was no more infection and closed up the wound and then moved me down to rehab. And the emergency room doctor came in that day, that Wednesday, and I was in my wheelchair, and he sat down and took my hands, and he looked at me, and he goes, "Wow, you really look great for what you've been through." He said, "Did they tell you that 70% of people that get this disease die from it?" I said, "No, but I have a great God." And he goes, "You must."
70%. So you're in the minority, thankfully.
Yes.
In the minority, and you survived.
Yes.
Sheila, what kind of emotions did you go through to see Steve going up and down like this?
Well, like I said earlier, the song, One Day at a Time, just stuck with me. And I kept with that. And when I got home, because I had to come back to Walla Walla because I had a job at the university that I had to continue, and I had duties here at the church. So that next Sabbath, I was up here on the platform, and I explained to the congregation that Steve had his foot amputated the week before, but he's doing fine, and thank you for your prayers, and I continue to ask for your prayers. And my morning worship, when I got home that next day, Steve was still in the hospital up in Missoula, and I got home, and I do systematic worship where I just read through the Bible and page after page, and this is what came up that first morning in Habakkuk 3, verses 17 through 19. "Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold," and that word "cut off" touched my heart because Steve's foot was just cut off, "and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on high hills again." And this was just the encouragement that I needed to get me through those dark days. And there were quite a few dark days, but one day at a time, I was able to be encouraged by the Lord's love and to get me through the hope that I had in him to get us through these times.
So you and Steve at that point didn't even know if Steve would be able to walk again.
Right.
And here you have this promise that says you'll walk again.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes.
And this happened when you were at a real low point.
Very low. Very low.
Steve, you are walking again. In fact, it's your left leg, the one that will be closest to the camera. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could just show us a little bit, okay, of your prosthetic device. It took a little while to get there, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
It's like learning to walk all over again.
So starting fresh.
Yep.
And you weren't able to get into that right away, right?
No, it took about 6 months for the wound to actually heal enough that it would take the pressure because, the bone is just right there. And it took a while for it to heal so that I could get up and start walking. And even then, I had to really
Was it
work
hard
on
to wait?
Oh, yes, it was. It was.
But God brought you through it all.
Amen.
God brought you through it all.
There was a lot of prayers.
And being a part of a church family helped too, didn't it?
It helped
Amen.
tremendously, yes. We were never alone. We had our church family and fellow believers that gave us encouragement every single day.
Friends, you may be feeling all alone right now. You may feel like the world is crashing down around you. But I want to recommend to you the God that Steve and Sheila love. Maybe you'd like to be part of a church family to have the kind of support that they felt. There's no substitute for knowing Jesus.
Amen.
And there's no substitute for having a family that surrounds you with love and prayer. Thank you for joining us for this story of hope.